Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and welcome to another pod shoot. I have back Robin, who you might have seen in a previous podcast with me a few months back, and I'm thrilled to have Agnes. Let me Callard is the right pronunciation, or you can
Callard.
Callard. Sorry, so
No problem.
already messed up. just starting this out. Uh, Agnes also. I'm always happy to bring back people from the University of Chicago, since I think some of the best years of my life were spent at University of Chicago. Agnes might know I was a student, both undergraduate and graduate,
Oh, okay.
in the mid '70s. And I have to tell you, the first time I was invited back to give a lecture, it was really like I couldn't believe, that, as a student there, I never really thought, that I would ever have the credentials that anybody would ever ask me to come back and give a talk. Since then, I've given several lectures there. And it's always a very special feeling for me when I'm on the campus. I love my time as it used to be known. I don't know if it's that known anymore, but it used to be, people used to refer to it as the life of the mind.
People still say that.
And I think it was a great description of the experience at the university. I really loved it. So here we're going to be talking today about the regulation of attention. And when we talk about the regulation of attention, we're really talking about self-regulation, not government regulation or third-party regulation, but how we regulate ourselves. Agnes, I thought you would start off by, when we talk about regulation of attention, how would you define attention?
So I have not tried to do this before, but off the top of my head, I would define attention as something like the direction of consciousness, either outside towards the object of sense experience or internally towards one's own state, right? So it's what determines what you are currently aware of. Attention determines that. That's how I would define it.
Yes, and I think it was William James said that everyone understands what attention is. I'm not sure whether that's really the truth or not, but he
He
said
also said something else about attention, which I found, I think it's probably true, but it's kind of shocking. He says there is no such thing as voluntary attention sustained for more than a few seconds at a time. That is, he basically says you can't attend to anything for more than a few seconds. If it seems as though you're attending to the same topic for a long period, what's really happening is that you are sort of bringing the topic back a bunch of different times, and you are showing it in different forms, right? So basically he thinks you can't attend continuously to anything that is not changing. So if you were looking at a painting for a long time, you would have to move your attention over it.
I always thought, for me, paying attention is something very, very important, because I really made my money as a speculator in capital markets. So if you don't pay close attention, you're not going to do very well. You have to. I think that Fisher Black, in a paper he gave as the American Finance Association, as a presidential address a long time ago, wrote a paper called Noise, and it was a speech he gave, and he basically said that the difference between economics and, I'm grossly simplifying it to make it quick, but he said basically the difference is, and maybe Robin will start criticizing my simplification, but maybe I wasn't paying close attention, but but to simplify it, he basically said the difference between economics and finance is that in economics, in the dependent variable, you have the epsilon, the error term, that the error term is pure white noise. In economics, that's how it's treated, as noise. In finance, he said, everything interesting is embedded in the error term. So the error term is not really all white noise. It's a lot of noise, and the most valuable information is embedded in that. It's like finding the proverbial needle in a haystack. So the way to make money in finance is sifting through all the noise to get to the real information that will help you make money in the markets. So to do that, you have to pay very, very close attention to doing that. So, so for me, I think attention is something that has always been, important to me, even though when I was in school, a lot of teachers would yell at me, Jeff, start paying attention. And it was not that I wasn't paying attention. Not that I wasn't paying. It's true, I was not paying attention to them, but it's not like I wasn't paying attention. I was just paying attention to something other than them. But in this era of now where people have all their phones, are you still giving classes?
Yes.
So how do you find over the years about students being able to sit in a class and pay attention during a lecture?
I have not allowed any devices in my class for 15 years. So they don't have any option but me and like looking out the window or something else. So that's my competition. But maybe it's worth just taking a step back to sort of like why I think this is a topic, because I think that a lot of the regulation of attention, let's say for all animals, not only for human beings, sort of happens in a straightforward way by means of incentives, as the case you just described. If you don't pay attention, you'll lose money.
Right.
And if someone is chasing me, I'm going to be paying pretty close attention to like where are my possible places of escape, right? So there are the world puts demands on my attention such that even if my attention in and of itself is inclined to wobble around in a situation where, I don't have clear incentives, in many cases, you might think the regulation happens of its own accord by the fact that, I'll pay attention when I need to. And then the issue is, what if that need gets less and less and we get more and more of a space of freedom? Do we have to somehow pick up some of that slack and regulate our own attentions? And a case that I think is worth comparing is like the case of the regulation of sexuality. So I just happen to have been reading Rousseau's discourse on inequality, and he has, and let's just assume this is true for a minute. I think it's implausible, but it'll just help the case. Assume this is true. The way that he understands primitive humans is that they were largely solitary. And they had sex with one another when they felt like it, and they did not stick around long enough to raise children. The mother had a bond with the baby, but not the father, such that the father wouldn't know which children are his own, because by the time that he's gone, and then they there's no way to tell.
And they had no DNA testing back then.
Sorry.
No paternity testing back then.
No paternity testing, exactly. And that in this world, as he imagines it, there's not much by way of sexual jealousy or sexual possessiveness. Nor is there's no property. This is very primitive humans. And the thought is that like at some point along the line, we get ourselves into a situation where where sex represents a possible harbinger of violence. So when human beings when families start to like actually live together, and when we start to get dwellings, then paternity becomes an issue, and jealousy becomes an issue, and possessiveness. And that's when you start to need the regulation of sexuality, right? Mm-hmm. So on this story, this would just be a story of how the regulation of sexuality doesn't like come of its own accord. It shows up at a particular point in human history, again, in a possibly fictitious human history. And then maybe later, when we have like birth control, we have actually reason to let up on that regulation. Most of this regulation is self-regulation. Okay, there's no government even for the humans who are slightly less primitive and already living in huts, right? So this is self-regulation, or it's intra-family regulation, something like that. Eventually, it's to some extent becomes government regulation, but that springs from the real need for regulation. And so my question is, are we entering into some kind of a period with attention that is a little bit like the transition of the human beings that are just wandering by themselves to the ones who live in houses with their families, where suddenly we are needing to not let our attention roam free as it has for this whole part of human history largely, but we need to come up with some kind of technology, at first a personal technology, for managing it, orchestrating it.
So could I speak up?
Yeah,
I spent the last couple of hours reading some review articles on attention, which I didn't learn that much from. But I guess the one thing that stands out to me here is that if you focus on the word attention and the immediate context of attention, you're thinking about your narrow focus at any one moment, and then how it might wander nearby that and what sort of prompts might move it. But the way we regulate attention is more often through much, much larger contexts that we control that limit what might be around us. So we have a quiet office so that we don't get disturbed, so we can focus on things. And then, even sexual attention, people would wear modest clothes and not be exposed to the opposite sex, and they would limit who was around who and what sort of things they could see as ways to limit their attention about those things. And that most of our regulation of attention in our world is the choice of context that we make at larger timescales, and that will be how most of the future will change. We will change what our social apps look like and where we sit and what sort of things we're allowed to interrupt us with a phone call, etc. I mean, those are the things that have changed our regulation of attention over time, and that's plausibly what will change it in the future. And so then the key choices will be, well, what are our priorities about attention? How much do we want to be interrupted by what priority things? What sorts of things do we want to be in our field of view such that they might distract us? What are our priorities with respect to, I don't know, even some salacious sexual thing that might grab your attention that way? Do we want censorship to limit it, or in some other way because we don't want to be bothered by that? Or do we want it and therefore want those things to show up? That's the key issues, is about these larger contexts. So most of the agonizing over social media is the idea that social media platform, by the structure, makes a lot of choices about what you're likely to see and not see. And that people know that, and they want to control that. They don't just trust people to make their own choices about platforms. They want to come in and limit their choice of platforms and limit the platform options because they want to control that. But fundamentally, it's those larger contexts that are going to be setting the main choices about regulation of attention.
Now, listening to both Agnes and your comment, Robin, kind of made me think about the fact of linking sexuality with attention. Made me think about the practice that are in various religions, like in Judaism and the Muslim religion now, how married women cover themselves so they don't call attention to themselves, so they're not attractive to anyone, other than their husband. So when you go to an Orthodox or ultra Orthodox synagogue, they separate men and women. And again, the married women have to dress, with the wigs and covering their bodies, so you can't really see their sexuality. So your attention is focusing on the service, the sermon, reading the Torah, reading the Quran, and not necessarily, for the single guys looking over at the women, looking to covet, either some married woman or some single woman who are at that. So that's sort of like, if you can view the organization of a synagogue or a mosque as being some sort of government, that's sort of a third party regulation of people's attention, and you understand that if you don't follow the rules, you become a pariah in the community and are probably kicked out. So it seems to me part of the things we do, and the other examples that you also gave, Robin, is if you want to focus on something, you go somewhere so you won't be distracted. So it's trying to like creating an environment for you that makes, how difficult is it for you to pay attention when you have distractions around you, or do you have to eliminate all the distractions around you as a prerequisite for being able to pay attention?
Maybe one way to put my thesis about what has changed is that it has become much more difficult to make those choices of context to sort of eliminate the distractions, because my office can be quiet, but it's got the internet. And there's kind of no way for me to make that not be the case. That is, and I say this as somebody who, for many years, I wrote my whole dissertation in the coffee shop on the UC Berkeley campus where I couldn't get internet access. And that was important to my ability to concentrate. So I put myself in that context, right? But now, okay, I'm a professor. I can't not have email access in my office. It just wouldn't work. And so it seems like for a lot of us, the problem we have with social media isn't the problem that you described, Robin. It isn't that somebody else is making choices about an algorithm, or I want to make choices about what they put in the algorithm. It's that we are tempted to get distracted in ways that we think are bad for us. And we find it really hard to avoid yielding to the temptation. And part of why it's really hard to not just choose another context is that these things are on our phones, and we need our phones for everyday life. I resisted getting a smartphone until I think it was like 2019. I was one of the last people to get a smartphone for this reason. But it just basically, when I would travel, I would have to take my husband's smartphone. And eventually he was like, I think you need to get your own phone, because it's really annoying to not have my phone every time that you're traveling. So it actually seems to me like, in a weird way, we have less and less power over choosing our context. In a classroom, because I am the tyrant, I can just say to the students, like, no devices. And so I think we could try to subject ourselves to tyrants of that kind. But in general, we're not inclined to do that. And mostly tyranny is not chosen by the tyrannized. That's kind of the truth about tyranny, right? So, they're in my classroom for other reasons. And then I can use that to be like, okay, no devices. And they can even be grateful. I think they are actually mostly grateful for it. But there's just a problem about how to put this on oneself. And maybe just to go for a moment to sexuality, I don't think that the way that we sort of solved the problem of sexual attention. Yes, I think some of it is through all these practices of clothing, et cetera. But how are those underwritten? That is, how do you get people to sit on a certain side? I went to a Jewish school where the girls and boys sat on different sides of the synagogue, an Orthodox Jewish school. How do you get people to do those things? How do you get women to wear wigs, cover their bodies, et cetera? The answer is shame. That is, you have to inculcate in them profound feelings of shame. And we just don't have that apparatus yet with attention. We don't have anything of that kind. And I think that the thought, oh, we'll just make the choices, is a bit naive in the absence of a force like shame.
Well, actually, shame is what I used when I used to teach when I first went to Mexico. I taught at the university here called ITAM. I taught in the graduate program. I taught several courses as an adjunct professor. And I actually used shame in the classroom. I didn't put any rules in, but if I found students that looked like they were distracted somewhere, I point them out and I say, okay, you're now going to have a verbal exam in front of the whole class. And so people wanted to, after several people were shamed by me asking questions that they couldn't answer, and a few actually cried in the classroom because they felt
shame plus tyranny, though.
So
we're going to need just pure shame, which is harder to manufacture.
Right. so then people were more incentivized to try and pay attention because they wanted to avoid being given. And in the beginning of the class, I told my first time, I said, I've never actually taught. I've lectured, but I've never taught a class. I'm teaching a class. I don't really care if you want to learn or you don't want to learn. I don't care. I'm going to do my best as a teacher. You'll grade me as a teacher, and if you think I'm lousy, you'll tell the university I'm lousy, and they'll get rid of me. And but
it turned out you did care.
But then I said, if you're not paying attention, either quit the class because you think I'm a lousy teacher, or it's because you think you already know everything. And if you think you already know everything, I'm going to assume if you're not paying attention, I'm going to assume you already think you know everything. So that's how I'm going to interpret you not paying attention. So that way I'll subject you to an oral exam, at that point in time, since you obviously are not paying attention because you think you know everything, and if you think I'm boring, you should just quit the class. So if they didn't quit the class, then my assumption was that they thought they already knew everything. And so if they thought I knew everything, I already had warned them I was going to call them and give them an oral exam, which is I did. And of course, nobody was able to do well in the oral exam. And then people started paying attention. And actually nobody, nobody quit my class. So,
but why did you feel the need? Suppose there is somebody who is claiming that they already know the material in the class. And suppose that you have reason to believe that's not the case. Where in your mandate does it fall to show to them or to the rest of the class that this is not the case?
Where in my mandate?
Yeah, I mean, if your thought was, well, you either learn or you don't learn. So my point is, you were paternalistic, right? So you thought it was your job, for instance, to show the students who believe they knew but didn't know, to show them and the rest of the class that they didn't know. So that's the kind of benefit those students had. They had the benefit of a tyrant, right, who thought he knew their good better than they did. And I do agree that those environments can work for regulation of attention.
The worst thing for people to be confronted with is a sense of shame. Is my
right. But my point is, why are you confronting them with it? And my point is, that's because you take yourself to be in a position where you understand, you're in a paternalist position, right, where you understand their good better than they do. And my point is, eventually we're gonna have to regulate our own attentions without benevolent dictators like you around, or me, right? And so we're gonna need some source of shame that isn't piggybacking on that. I know Robin wants to get in here.
Yeah, Robin.
Okay, so your key claim is that we, for thousands of years, we've had to manage attention in lots of contexts. And now you see this phone thing and you say, oh, the phone is a problem because either have the phone or I don't. And I don't have the phone. There's this vast space of things that show up in my attention that I'm not controlling. And it seems to me that's
just... I mean, if I do have the phone.
If you do have the phones, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so if you see this binary choice, it's either nothing and I can't have nothing, or everything and I can't control everything. But that's just seems to me a consequence of how recent this is. I mean, for example, your phone has lots of different apps. You don't have to be in all the apps at any one time. And even on social media, we're going to learn to partition it more and, manage it more. We're just going to, over time, create more mechanisms for segregating these things and having ways, levers you can control to turn off some channels and others. And once we do that, it'll be more like the world you've been in so far, which is already lots of different areas where we separately have different ways that we control attention in each area. So an analogy would be somebody who's a cook in a kitchen. Well, they're going to be tempted to eat all day because there's just food all around them. The rest of us, if we have snacks in our office, now we're going to be tempted to eat the snacks. So we can make sure to take the snacks away. Most people aren't like being in the kitchen all the time because they've chosen their environment not to have food around them, but they could. And we will be choosing similarly not to have tempting food all around us because that doesn't go well.
I am a connoisseur of attention management software of various kinds. I've tried a lot of strategies with apps on my computer. So I don't come to this not having tried any of it. There are lots of options available now. There's many, many products to solve this problem. And what I'm telling you is, even with all the products, there's a huge problem. And
but I'm saying that's new. Like, you're only a decade or two into this world. You'll have centuries to go.
Look, I mean, what I'm saying is we're going to have to move towards a future in which we grapple with this problem. Perhaps we will grapple with it technologically. I'm not ruling that out as a possibility, but I will say that, I've been using attention management software since the 2000s, and it felt much more viable to me. That is something that worked and helped me focus my attention a long time ago. And that's been less and less the case. And it has to do with the fact that how interconnected everything is. Just the fact that I really need access to the library website to do my work. And that, it's really hard to get your browser such that it cuts off only the things that you wouldn't want. It's very hard to define those things. And over time, it gets harder. The project seems to get less feasible. That's my experience.
Well, it's not the library website that's your problem. You're not tempted to go all the way over the library website because
Right.
it's right.
What
So
I'm
it's-
saying is that it's hard to figure out. Let's even say Twitter, right? I mean, is it right that Twitter is always 100% of the time a distraction? No, actually, sometimes there's something that links to a tweet that gave some valuable piece of information that I might want. It's that creating rule. It's very, very hard to create rules for, cordoning my browser within the place where I want it to be cordoned.
So Agnes, I read this Zola novel a while back about the invention of the first big superstore.
Department store.
Right? And one of the key things there is that the department store was designed to suck you in and distract you. That is, and that's more analogous maybe to like, you can go to a weather site like to learn the weather, but it's not going to pull you into lots of other things because, it's just the weather site, or look up a thing in the library. The thing about social media.
I mean, the library website totally does suck me in, and I end up looking around at different stuff. So that's a bad example as it happens. But
okay, but if you think about just back then, ordinary stores, you go to the butcher, you would buy meat or not, but it's not going to distract you with lots of other stuff. And the superstore, the department store, is now sucking you in and trying to distract you with many things. And then people learn to manage their time. If they're going to let themselves go to the department store, it's because they think they have enough time to let themselves be distracted by things at the department store. But if they don't have time to be distracted at the department store, they're not going to go there. They're going to go to the other, more stores they need to go to, like the butcher, just to get the things they get. And that's the kind of world we're in. We've got some apps like weather or whatever. There's not that much risk of getting sucked into things. And then there are some larger worlds. And then we have to manage our attention by saying, well, if I'm going to let this larger world thing be open, I'm taking the risk of getting sucked into things. And we're going to make that same trade-off as with shopping. So even today, people go to the mall. By going to the mall, one of the things you knew is you might wander around the mall and look at other things. That's different than going to a very particular store for a very particular thing. And we learn to manage whether we go to the mall or whether we go to a particular store.
I just think more and more everything is located in the department store. That is this thing where you could just go to a butcher separately or go to and I don't want to say, Robin, that I think that you're just not very distractible. So like you're just not going to feel my pain here. But if you are distractible, if you're that kind of a person, you're like the canary in the coal mine for the future of all of humanity, which is that what you see is that more and more any intellectual activity in which you might be engaged is going to require a ChatGPT window open, a browser window open, a library window, etc. And all of those things are portals to a million different sub-stores within the department store. And that is, that's just a whole new form of human experience for which nothing has prepared us.
But we did manage it with the department store, right? That is, we have a much longer history about the department store. Department store was created, it started to exist, it spread, but then people managed their attention in terms of how often they let themselves go to the department store.
Yeah, but I kind of think the internet is where we all moved into the department store. And I sort of mean also about the shopping part, right? The fact that like my browser is also, I could, at any moment I could be like, oh, I could shop for dinner on Amazon right now. Just the fact that that's possible.
So actually before the department store, there were cities. Like if you're in a small town, you have a limited number of things that can distract you when you go into town. But when you go into a city, part of the attraction of a city and the risk of a city is like, you could wander through the city going to the store that you wanted, but there's all these things you will pass that could drag your attention in. And people living in cities learn to manage their attention so that they wouldn't always be wandering the streets, looking at new stores.
I think there's something that the computer and the internet has done, that I agree with Agnes on. I think, and if you look at really throughout history, it's only really been relatively recent history that people had much leisure time. So when you're working all the time, it's hard to be distracted. So it's like, so we invented all these distractions once people had leisure time so that people could figure out what to do with all the leisure time they had. And then there was then that became competing for people's attention while they had leisure time. So, and leisure time that they were not accustomed to having, and then trying to figure out what they were doing in the spare time that they never had before. Because much of human history, there was like almost no leisure time, and now there's a lot of leisure time. difference is right now we had distractions when we're not at work. So, I mean, when at work, there were no distractions, right? There was no internet. I mean, there's no way you could start having an experience outside your workplace remotely, right? You had to leave the workplace to get to the distraction. Now you can be distracted while you're working, whether people are looking at, I mean, how many times have you read stories about people being discovered when they watch people's internet practices at work, people looking at pornography. So, and doing other things that distract them. So right now, the question, is we don't have to leave our desk. We don't have to go anywhere else to find distractions. All the distractions we need are at our fingertips, at our computer, our iPad, our iPhone, whatever phones we use, our computer. So the distractions are always with us. So and people find them tempting, whether they're at work, or on their leisure time, and that is the new phenomena. Because what you're talking about, Robin, yes, it's true. There were cities and places like that, but the only time you had access to that is when you're during your leisure time. Now you have access to everything all the time, and I think that's the big change, and it's probably the reason why Agnes doesn't allow those distractions in her classroom, because she wants everybody focused on what she has to say and nothing else, and doesn't want anybody distracted by having any competition for attention.
Also,
so,
I will say this: I can speak not only as a teacher, but I'm the director of undergraduate studies. I run the undergraduate program in philosophy, which means I watch other people's teaching, and I sit at the back of the room, and I look at those computer screens that are open, and almost all of them have a window that is chatting with your friends, playing online games of some kind, shopping. There's a lot of shopping going on during classes, shoe shopping, whatever. And they know that those students know I'm there. They know I can see them right in the back of the room. They know this professor is being observed. So I just see it. It's not, I didn't do it for this reason because I started my rule before I became DUS, but now I've seen it. It's really true that it's just very, very hard for students. Even I think students who really care about the class, want to learn the material, could be engaged by the material. It's just hard for them to get themselves to make the choice of take out a piece of paper and write this down instead of going on your computer because you're going to start opening other windows.
It seems to me that most of this is about a choice that is, as Jeffrey says, because we have so much more leisure and we're richer, we aren't tempted to just indulge ourselves in allowing ourselves to be distracted more often, even at work. That is, if you can get your job done at work and sometimes shop, then you think it's a win-win, right? So I think you could at work just only have apps on your phone or your computer that couldn't distract you. That would be feasible. Just people might not enjoy it as much.
It's not true. It's not feasible. That's what I'm saying. You're just, I'm not distracted by apps. I'm distracted by ChatGPT. I go off by Wikipedia. Okay, I can lose an hour on Wikipedia easily. There's all this kind of fascinating stuff that I want to know. I'll just go down some rabbit holes.
It would be completely feasible to have, an AI watching these uses and saying, "Is this really for work? Explain why this is for work, Agnes."
It might be feasible. It doesn't currently exist. So none of the technology
that would be feasible soon,
exists,
whether we would want it.
Right. And part of it is I want to grant that part of the problem here is that I am both the enforcer and the, person on whom the thing is being enforced. And that is creating a problem. And I'm kind of interested in how do we solve that problem with sexuality? And as I say, I think it's something like very deep-seated feelings of shame that don't require the being activated by a benevolent tyrant or, even a government. People police their own sexualities willingly. How can we get that? How can we get that with attention is my question.
So long before the internet, I had this habit, or well before the internet, at work and at school. So I would just learn in a work meeting to take something to read because I could read something and pay enough attention to the meeting because I wasn't central to these meetings. And then when I went back to grad school, there were even small, graduate classes, and I would have something to read while listening to lecture because the lecture was too slow, and a professor was upset. Well, you shouldn't be reading my lecture. But I could say, ask me anything about what you've been saying, and I'm there.
If you have been in Jeffrey's class, you would have passed the exam. I believe you about that. But you do know that you're atypical, and that with most of my students who are not paying attention, if I were to give them Jeffrey's exam, they would not pass.
Right. So this is about calibrating to what extent you can be distracted and still, not suffer too much in your whatever you're doing. It's the same for driving, right? People driving, should you listen to the radio or talk on the phone or listen to an audiobook or just look at the road? It's a judgment about, well, how much could you be distracted and still function as a driver? And, we're having to make those choices. But as we've learned enough, I think, about driving, roughly how much, in fact, you can be distracted and still effectively drive.
But I just think it's obvious that we're extremely bad at making these choices
because those are new. That is, but for driving, I think we've roughly got it. I think most people driving have roughly the decent sense of how much they need to pay attention to the road.
It's not that new. And the driving thing, I think people figured that out pretty quickly. So I just think it's a much harder problem than the driving problem.
Yeah, I one thing I agree with Amazon. I don't think people are very good at making choices about how they self-regulate their attention. So I think as we learn through a lot of the cognitive mistakes that people make, and what we've seen in the fields of the behavioral science fields, that people tend to overestimate their skills, and so they tend to think they're better at most things than they actually are. So I think people who tend to think that they can multitask, I've heard a lot of people tell me
Right.
that they can multitask. So I take their word for it until they prove
Right.
themselves to be a liar. I had this partner in this one business, and he would bring his BlackBerry with him to the meetings. We was doing a partner just in a deal. So we were a partner in this deal. It was a real estate deal, and he was very good at what he did. But he'd come to meetings, and when he and I were meetings, and he was on his phone, I didn't care. But when we were meetings with a team, I thought it was rude to other people, so I didn't like him doing it. So he said, "Oh, I can multitask." So I said, "Okay, I'm going to take your word for it." And so the first time I multitasked, when people were talking, I said, "Stop for a minute," and I said to him, "Okay, just tell me what you heard in the last 5 minutes." And he heard nothing. So I said, "But you can't multitask."
Right. Good job.
So then I said, you and your BlackBerry can go somewhere else. So I kicked him out of the meeting. So
that shows that you were in fact not going to take his word for it.
Right.
Well, I was going to
temporarily.
I was giving him enough rope to hang himself. So that's
a different expression. Yes.
So
that's my strategy. My usual strategy is, instead of telling people you're full of shit, I let the people prove that they're full of shit, and then I laugh at them proving themselves as full of shit. So, but many people actually think that they can multitask. And, I myself am guilty at being in a meeting where I decide that I'm bored at the meeting and I'm looking for something else to distract myself. And sometimes I have to then tell somebody, what did you just say? And if they want to kick me out of the meeting, I would understand that as well. I just want to make one point about the shame point. I just want to get back to one thing. Where did I learn the concept of shaming people? Was at University of Chicago, when I gave at one of the conferences, when you gave the talks, at the workshops. And what were the jobs of your professors there? They would shame you, to remind you how dumb you were. As you were making a paper, you were very proud of the work, thinking that you're really smart. And then they're there to make sure to put you in the place that you're not as smart as you think you are, because we're going to ask a whole bunch of questions that we know you're not going to. We hope you're not going to answer, so we can prove why you still need us. To teach. So I really learned the tactic, as giving papers at workshops at University of Chicago.
So a history of technology is that, like, when television or radio or novels or movies or, recordings or even writing, the introduction of each of these major forms of communication change, there were a lot of people saying it was going really badly. That people were, like, first romance novels, way too many people reading romance novels, first TV, way too many people watching TV, wasting their time. And we look back on that and we think, oh, that must have been some just exceptional people who were just way over the top complaining about things. But I'm inclined to believe that, in fact, these complaints were, in fact, roughly right at the time. That is, in the initial introduction of each of these things, the world hadn't figured out how to deal with those things, and that, in fact, a lot of people were wasting a lot of time with the first novels and radio and TV all the way through the line, which then could give us hope that we are, in fact, suffering large costs from these new things, but over time we will learn.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, there's a question about how long. But in a way, my interest is in trying to get a grip on what kind of learning that learning is going to be. That is, we're not so close to the beginning right now that we can't at least start to think about that. What could the regulation of attention consist in? And you made a suggestion, Robin, where my reply was, that's not going to be it. That is, I don't think it's getting to control which apps show up on your phone, because that's like somebody who hasn't fallen off the deep end kind of suggestion. I don't think it's going to be the kind of software that currently exists for, you can list websites you want to block or whatever. That exists. I've used it. At the end of the day, it doesn't work because the web is too connected. It's too much of a web.
Let's ask about the telephone, right? Once upon a time, when you had a telephone in your desk, in principle, you could call anybody in the world and talk to them about anything. But that doesn't seem to have sucked people into hours and hours wasting time on the telephone at work. It did for some people, but not very many, right? So they might ask, well, what about the telephone made it, you're able to manage the attention because you could have this phone book and you could call anybody, right? That's similar to like looking at any website or asking LLM any question.
I think that's a good question. I think that it's pretty important to the kind of bottomless pit nature of this internet attention problem that it is not social. So you're not wasting anyone else's time. I mean, your employers in one sense, if you're employed, right. But you, when you're on the phone with someone, at every moment that you're on the phone with them, you're conscious of the question, wait, do they actually want to get off the phone with me now? And they're just staying on the phone because they think that I need them to? Every second that you're on the phone, you're aware of that. And that creates a tension for all phone conversations, which is why like my kids all don't use their phones to call each other. They text, because texting gets away from that problem. It gets away from the problem that the thing you're doing is suspended on someone's goodwill to continue the interaction. So I would, it makes sense to me that phones would not, that telephones would not create this bottomless pit effect.
Let me give you another example. An employee at a bookstore or a librarian, we must have had those people going back for centuries. Would they be tempted to spend all their time looking at all the books around them as opposed to doing their job as a librarian or a bookstore?
I think how I would counter that, Robin. One is at work. Okay, my assumption is that those that probably are spending a lot of time on the phone, or those that and don't regulate attention well, are probably not the people in the C-suites. So they're too busy to have those types of phone calls. And so if you're not in a C-suite, you're probably not in an office or in a private office. So if you're a long time on the phone, people will notice that you're a lot on the phone and probably say something about it, and you might lose your job if it looks like you're spending an inordinate amount of time on the phone. And the other thing is again, if you're not in your private office and you're spending a lot of time on the phone, you're probably at some cubicle bothering the people that are working next to you. So I think that peer pressure will keep you from abusing that privilege. So I think that there's some going back to the concept of people will be shamed if they go beyond a reasonable norm of using that distraction, so that maybe it's the shaming that would regulate people from engaging in that. And again, going back to the computer age, you can do it and nobody knows what you're doing. When you're looking at your screen, unless somebody's really peering over you, they don't know what you're looking at.
If you put everybody in cubicles such that they're 2 feet away from each other, they can all see all their screens. And in the classrooms you're talking about, you're in the back, you're seeing all these screens. They can all see each other's screens.
But the teacher
something's failing among these students.
And in the cubicles, that's not true. That's not true of cubicles. That's not true of the way cubicles are designed. You cannot see each other's screens.
Yes, yeah.
But you could design cubicles where you could. I mean, if we just wanted to use shame, we could make people able to see each other's screens like they are in the classroom. In the classroom, students see each other's screens.
Right. But I'm saying is they don't care that the students can see their screens. They care whether the professor can see their screens.
Right, because you haven't made much of a group productivity, consciousness in the classroom like you do in a workplace.
Well,
but you could.
Somebody looking at that screen will only get the attention of some neighbor looking at their screen and looking at the screen if they're seeing something they like to see on the screen. But they're not going to complain this person's looking at something on the screen because they don't want to be, branded as a rat or something.
But why at the work would they complain? I mean, again, you're saying at the work people would be shamed.
at work, it could impair their own functionality. If somebody's at a cubicle and they need a reasonable level of quiet for them to be productive, and then somebody's on the phone a long period of time and they found that phone call distractive from their productivity, and they can't get their work done because the noise is inhibiting them from getting their work done, it's that would have them complain, not the consequences of somebody talking on someone else being productive, when whatever I'm looking at a screen doesn't impair somebody else's productivity, so they're less likely to have something that they would complain about.
I think you're right, Robin, that see how I was faster than you there? I think you're right that that we can devise things that would get around this problem. So if there was something on my computer watching me, right? That is, so I think, Jeffrey, this is a really good point that in fact, the kind of antisocial experience of the internet, the fact that like there's no one around me. In fact, I deliberately work in such a way that my husband sits, you can't see there, but he sits where he can see my screen at all times. So I'm also making use of the shame leverage. But mostly we work in such a way that other people can't see our screens. That's a big, or they can't see what we're looking at on our phones. That's really important to people, that other people can't see what they're looking at on the screens on the phones. If we change that, that would have a huge effect, I think. And it wouldn't be impossible to change that. It wouldn't be impossible to make what's on every student's screens visible to the professor or whatever. I think that there's a way in which like that kind of solution, though, is not one we're likely to go for. That is, people, maybe there's this issue of people have to get to a point of realizing how bad the problem is before they would opt for that. And I guess
it has
they
to
would
be
eventually.
Bad. Right. If the problem were bad and we cared enough, then we would do those things. And so that's just a bet about what other solutions will work. How better? I tell
you how often I run the undergrad program, which means undergrads come to me with their complaints. And I just get a lot of students coming to me saying, I guess I must have ADHD or something because I just can't focus on my work. I can't get through my reading. And like, I really, really want to. This is super important to me. I believe them that they really want to and that it's important to them. And they are just not able to fight against these things that they also can't live without, their computers and their phones. It really is bad already.
But so, I mean, here's the solution, a science fiction scenario. You could just say, okay, in the future, when you go to college, you just have to be in a group of 3. At the beginning, first month, you pick your 2 partners and you're going to spend the rest of your college career with these 2 other people, and you're all going to go to classes together and study together, and you're going to be watching each other. And if you guys can't figure out how to make each other work or not screw up, then 3 of you will fail together. And we're going to do work groups like that too. We're just going to have groups of 3 sit next to each other, see each other's screen, and they promote it through the company. That would be a thing we could do. Now that would be a high cost, right? But it's limited, the cost. You can see how that has a cost, but it's only so bad. And now the question is the cost of whatever else you hope to do to solve this problem lower than that cost? But I can bound the cost of this problem by saying, oh, I see this solution. And if we are willing to do that, it would solve the problem. And the question is, do we want to do it some other way?
It would. That is, you might get trios who just all go down together.
Right, but everybody would learn about that and say, well, you have to really be careful to choose your trio because, that's one of the biggest important choices you make. And if you choose wrongly, it'll go badly for you. And people would be learning to pay attention to that choice. In the same way, you pay attention to who you get married to. Without marriage, of course, we could each have more individual lives, or we could do more things by ourselves and be less constrained by our spouses. But it's important enough to form pairs. Because that just makes our lives much more effective.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. It's anyway an intriguing suggestion. It's not anywhere near the space of possibility at the moment.
Right.
And I guess I feel unsure enough about the situation that I can't tell whether we're at the stage even of trying to solve the problem or whether we're still at the stage of trying to understand it.
Well, that's a good point. We can't solve something we don't understand yet. and I think probably. Well, I think there's a difference between problems that individuals have to solve on their own, and one that's problems that society has to. We want social problems that we want society to solve it. I think society has proven itself very poor. It's problem solving and not getting better, but getting worse at it. And maybe that is also because of the issue of attention and distractions. So on an individual level, I think they're somewhat related, because I think people as individuals feel less and less responsible for being held accountable for the choices that they make. So we tend to we live in a world where more and more of our losses are socialized, and we still like to privatize as many gains as possible, but we expect almost all losses to be socialized. So I think the incentive for people to feel responsible for their problems, and therefore motivated to solve them because it's their responsibility. I think society overall has created disincentives for people to solve problems that are their problems, because less and less of people being held accountable for what's should be their problem. So when I started my first business when I was 23. I was fortunate to have some very good partners who taught me a lot of things. And one of the things that one of my partners would sit down and mentor me a lot, and one of the things he always used to tell me is never make your problem somebody else's problem.
But you needed someone else's help to figure that out, right? That was your story. The story you've just told is a story about how people can't do things by themselves.
Well, at the end, I decided to listen to the person. So I decided to. I got fortunate in the fact is that I had a good mentor. But the question is, it's a voluntary relationship. So
listening is not something that anyone can do by themselves. It's not a private activity, right? There needs to be someone you're listening to. It's essentially at least two people involved if someone's listening.
Well, I think when I was younger and less experienced, I liked profiting off other people's experiences. So I like to learn from other people's experience. As I started having my own experiences, I get to a point where I didn't care about what anybody else said or thought. And, so I find myself that any decision I make, I live with the good and I live with the bad. And also, I've lived most of my life where I've made my real money as a speculator. So I don't listen to anyone when I make investment decisions. So I've never gone to anybody on Wall Street and asked for investment advice. When people would sit down and have a meal and people say, "Do you have any tips or any ideas you want to share?" I always just say no. And because I didn't want to even engage in the conversation. They're responsible for their ideas. I'm responsible for mine, and I wasn't going to share ideas with anyone. So on respect to something and how I was allocating capital. So that's a game where you keep score every day. So it's the most objective scorekeeping you have out there. You either have a profit that day or a loss that day. You're either accumulating wealth or you're going bankrupt. So at the end of the day, I know every trade I make, I'm responsible for, and how well it does. The only person I have to blame is the person I see in the mirror. So basically, and that's one of the things I really like about trading as a when people used to ask me, why don't you take other people's money, so you have a fund, and what is it that you like about this business? And I said, really, I spent part of the thing is because for me, trading was like a part-time activity, because I found that I didn't really need to devote a lot of hours to it. So it gave me a lot of time for me to read, which I love, so I got to, pursue my intellectual pursuits. But the other thing I liked about it is being someone who was antisocial, is I didn't have to bullshit anyone about anything. I don't have to go and say, look at this product, it's really good. This is why you should buy this. Gee, Goldman Sachs is better than Morgan Stanley because of this bank with this bank. And then you have to always be in the process of trying to tell people mostly bullshit. So I didn't want to interact with many people. And I certainly didn't want to bullshit anyone. So given the fact that I didn't want to interact with people or bullshit anyone, trading was a great activity. I could test my cognitive skills. Can I process things better than the marketplace? And if I did, I'll make money. If I can't, I'll try and have to figure out something else to do with my life. But then again, I'm ultimately, my circumstances are always a consequence of just my own actions. So I mean, I when I took partners in, the first time I was as a 23 years old. I had an idea, and matter of fact, I wasn't even looking for it. I was in a bookstore in New York, McGraw-Hill bookstore in New York, that used to exist on 6th Avenue, and I was piling up with books to pull out, and some person walked up to me and said, why are you buying these books? And by the way, can you give me advice? Because I see they're in finance and investments and things like that. So maybe you could give me some advice. And so this woman just picked up a conversation with me, and she started asking me questions. So I told her about my risk management model that I designed at the bank I was working for. And she said, have you ever thought about having your own business? I said, I don't know anything about business. I'm just a nerd who likes to read and study and do this stuff. And really, most of my money comes from my trading anyway. So I'm just doing this banking stuff to learn. I'm not really considering myself as a profession. I just want to learn banking. So, I'm here doing this. I want to make a career in banking. I just want to be inside a bank and learn and then leave. And so she introduced me to some people who said, we'll write you a check. And they wrote me a check. And, a year and a half later, I sold the company for a lot of money, mostly because I didn't want to have partners, even though I had good partners, but I just wanted to do my own thing again. So I've always had that orientation, and that's why also in business, I really like having partners and not employees. I don't want to have people that depend upon me. I want to have people that depend upon themselves. And I always want that relationship to be with everyone having, skin in the game. So I think we live in a society where where not many people really think that way. And I don't think people take ownership of things. And I think when they do, when they have the right incentives, I think then people will tend to pay it much more attention than they do, because the consequences of not paying attention, they don't want to accept. So right now, I think there is not a lot of consequence associated with not paying attention. The shame worked in the classroom, and your tyranny has worked to some extent in your classroom. But to the extent that we have to do these things, because most people are just really not very good at regulating themselves.
I think we can summarize. I'm happy to summarize the situation as saying that for most kinds of problems that you live through your life, if humans like you have had similar problems for a long time in the past, you can roughly rely on copying other people's habits and adopting them yourself to roughly solve those problems. But when humanity has a new problem that hardly anybody has ever had before, then we're all going to be learning about dealing with that. And there's less inherited wisdom about how to deal with it. And it's important for intellectuals like us to point out which ones those are, and then make sure people are more wary of those problems, because in fact, we don't know how to deal with them, and that we should be thinking more about, okay, what are we learning about how to deal with those? And, your individualism in finance finds a place because there have been a lot of very individualist people in finance for a long time. That's a slot the world's had for a long time. You as a young person could just inherit from some older mentors how people in that slot in the world manage themselves. But now when we all have an internet that distracts us, we can't go to say, how did my grandpa handle that problem? Because it wasn't so much a problem grandpa had. And so we're all trying to figure out what to do. But, by each of us trying different things and hearing how things go for other people, we will slowly figure out what works and deal with the problem. But it might be a bigger problem than other ones, whereas not all problems in history are going to be equally sized. And it's always a possibility that this will be an unusually large problem and take us unusually long to work out. But it's important to notice that there are some pretty extreme solutions we could adopt that would work. And then the question is just, okay, it can only get so bad because those extreme problems will probably work. Now, can we find a less extreme solution to deal with it so we don't have to go to those extremes?
I'm skeptical that people, again, going back to one, how many people actually think this is a problem? I don't know if many people think it's a problem.
I think a lot of people think it's a problem. Yeah, ask Jonathan Haidt.
Ask a lot of students, though, right? Yeah.
Ask all my students. Yes, they think it's a problem.
Okay, so to the extent that people, then the question is why, if they think it's a problem, why haven't they had sufficient motivation to solve a problem that they think is a problem?
Almost nobody ever does that. That's not what people do. people tend to try to look around what other people are doing for the problem and copy what other people are doing. That's mostly what people do. And that, as a larger scale, that does produce variation and, exploration of the space. But most people don't personally try to sit down with a problem and try to work out a solution and then implement it. That's just not what most people do.
That's just what Robin does. He's the only
Yes.
human left who does that.
And Jeffrey, to some extent, I expect. And even
I think there's maybe another wrinkle here, and pretty soon we're going to have to stop, but that I want to throw out there, which is something that I feel gets in the way of making progress, which is a lot of the places where the progress would be described are themselves like social media, or like these are the venues for the information coming out about like what people are trying, etc. And there is such a element of performance there, or it's like you're gonna describe your experiment in ways that are, the whole description is going to be dominated by how you want to come across in that particular context. Let's put it that way. And so, like, yeah, I just get a lot of people preaching at me about just read great books, or touch grass, or little like strategy. Like, there's a lot of people spouting strategies, but it doesn't feel authentic. It feels like, or regulation of social media. I feel like a lot of people who are like yelling for regulation of social media, they don't really want it. That's just another way to define yourself in a certain space, a personality, right? So there's something like, at the same time as we have this problem, something else is going wrong about how we might report the results of experiments.
I think most of the people we would hear from on social media would be people for whom this is less of a problem because their immersion in social media is going well for them. Like, every once in a while on Twitter or something, I see a message from someone says, I've been off this thing for years. I just come to make this one message, but I'm going to go back and like not get distracted by this stuff. Have a good time, guys. I'm making companies go and making money. I'm having a happy life. And I remember those people, but they don't show up very often.
Have you ever done Twitter surveys asking your followers, do you think you spend too much time on Twitter? Because I have. And it's like very high, the number who are like, yeah, way, way, way too much.
Right. But most of the people that would model after are people who are spending way too much time, because that's who they see, right? If you look at the models available to you on social media of ways to behave, those people are the ones there. You don't get much visual impression of people who are not spending much time on social media.
Right. So that may be part of why the problem is going to be exacerbated that way. That is, our place to look for the exemplars is going to be a non-representative place.
If you saw some celebrity on a TV talk show and they said, what do you do on social media? You say, oh, I'm never on social media. I mean, that could be a thing if you say, oh, I should be like this guy because here's a celebrity. But we're not seeing those talk shows much.
That's right.
They're
we don't have like role models who are, using like the old-fashioned kind of camera, like not even using but they have to send the film camera.
Right.
Okay, we should stop.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting us, Jeff.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation very much. And Agnes, nice to at least meet you in Zoom, having had really enjoyed your writing. And I think your writing demonstrates a lot of thoughtfulness involved. So I'm sure that you have great success in when you put down to write, really focusing and paying attention, because I found that your reading your books requires me to pay a lot of attention, which I appreciate very much. So
thank you both for indulging my topic. I appreciate that.
That's my pleasure. And thank you, Robin, for coordinating this. Everyone have a great evening. Bye.
Bye.